All right. I don't think waiting any longer is going to make a difference. And you just hit play. So here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. I hope you're doing well. I've just been sitting here waiting to get into this intro. And, you know, the process of finding the windows of time and moments of inspiration to make this show happen every week is a subtle alchemy of intention and juggling of roles and responsibilities that I play. You know, I work out of home, so very often there's just like family things going on, and I'm usually doing this on Sundays, and it's just navigating being a dad and doing this, sneaking up here to the attic. It's not always an easy thing to do. And today I waited because, you know, all this stuff was going on in the house and people were taking showers. And when people are taking showers, you can hear the water running in the background. And maybe you don't notice these things, but I do my best to try to like get as best quality audio as I can. And if it's relatively quiet, this attic does a great job of like acting as a studio. But there's a few things that will come through the mic and kind of create background noise. Someone taking a shower, or if the fan in the room right downstairs is on, I can hear that. And so little things like that. And I try to get everything in place. And so today I waited and then I got everything in place, and then I got up here and everything should have been perfect. But I don't know if you can hear it. It's like thunderstorms and raining. And I have a slate roof right over my head, so creates all this noise. And I don't even know if you can even really hear it. You know, Josh is a audio guy, and he can EQ stuff, and sometimes it doesn't even come through the mic as much as it does in my ears when I'm sitting here in the room thinking, oh my God, listen to all this background noise. But really, it's just very fitting with this week's episode, because what's that expression, like, I make plans and then God laughs? I feel like that today, like I'm trying to make everything happen in a particular way and trying to kind of control things. And then, you know, the powers that be are kind of messing my hair up, you know, and being like, oh, you silly little guy, just record your intro and stop worrying about it. So that's what we're doing. And speaking of celestial communications or higher powers, I've been getting quite a bit of email feedback from listeners this week in particular, and I really appreciate it. Let me just say again, if you've listened to this show or you're listening to the show and you've been talking back to me on the show, or you've just, whatever, are inspired to share something about what you've gotten from the show, or you've got questions or criticisms or anything, do feel welcome to reach out. I really appreciate hearing from you. And some of you reached out this week, and some of you who reached out this week were very long time listeners, people who have listened regularly for many, many years. And when someone who's listened to the show for that many years, and I know because they've sent me emails, you know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and now they're emailing me again, I definitely pay very close attention and take those communications very much to heart. And this week, I got such a range of feedback about my recent inquiries into a creator and a higher power and God. Sometimes I've been using the word God. So one longtime listener was very thoughtful and frank and just expressed to me that they aren't really that into it. They're not into all the God talk that I've been doing. And I don't know, I felt like, have I been talking about God all the time? No, but I definitely bring it up a lot these days, don't I? And this person was just saying that they felt like they weren't that into it, and they were trying, but they weren't feeling it. And they almost felt like maybe it wants to be a different show. If I want to talk about God all the time, maybe that should just be like a separate show. And I really appreciated that. And my response was first to say thank you for taking the time to tell me, but also was then, okay, well, what conversations do you want to hear? And I'm saying that to everybody listening right now too. If you're not that into me asking people about God and you want to hear other kinds of conversations, let me know. Who do you want me to talk to? What aspects of yoga are you interested in hearing about? I'd love to take some threads from you all and see if I can find inspiration and weave something. That would be wonderful. So, hey, reach out and let me know. Now, I will also say that I got the counter view as well. I've got emails this week from longtime listeners telling me how much they were enjoying these recent inquiries into God and these kind of delvings that I've been doing. So, that's counterpointed by others who are really into it. Now, I will say, whether or not you're interested in me asking people about God, I do think it's in the wheelhouse of the show. I don't think that I've stepped outside of yoga. Sometimes I'm getting people who aren't necessarily yoga people specific or yoga teachers because I want to get other views. I mean, we got to try to open up the lenses, but they're certainly relevant to the implications of yoga, whether or not there are disembodied entities or whether or not those entities can be channeled like we were talking about last week, or even just the notion of a higher power or not, or these questions are certainly within the purview of yoga. And today's episode, I think, is a perfect example of that. My guests are Ranju Roy and Dave Charlton. And Ranju and Dave have been on the show before years ago, and they have been listening to a lot of these recent conversations that I've been having, and they showed up to talk to me about it. And I'm so grateful. It was so rewarding to have a real conversation from a place of curiosity, and I think deeply rooted in yoga practice and yoga inquiry. And it was just wonderful. I don't want to give anything away. I want you to listen to it. It's just a true joy to reconnect with Ranju and Dave and to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me just mention that if you are getting something from the show and you're interested in other ways to connect and learn with me, there are lots of ways to do that. Maybe you want to get deeper into the podcast with a podcast premium subscription, help support the show, get full access to the archives. Maybe you want some new information with the workshop, or you want some live classes or access to ongoing conversations between your fellow teachers, or maybe you want to deep dive in the teacher training. There's a full spectrum of possibilities to suit whatever your time and budget might be. You can find everything at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I will touch base with you on the other side for a little debrief, but there's so much here to get to. Here, did you hear that? Did you hear the thunder strike? I don't know if it'll come through, but the thunder struck right now when I said that. We've got quite a bit to get to, and I'm looking forward to it. So we're going to do that. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Ranju Roy and Dave Charlton. Hello?
Jay, hi. Hi.
Hi, Ranju.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I am okay. I've just we're just waiting for. I just talked to Dave, so he'll be on his way. I've just
Sure.
made myself a cup of tea.
Perfect. Me too. I've just settled in as well. And you know the deal, I think. I'm recording, and so this might end up as part of the episode,
That's
just
cool.
to know.
Well, I don't know whether everybody would like to hear that. I was thinking, I've got to make a cup of tea just before I go down. So I made myself a cup of tea, put the tea bag in, put some milk in, came down thinking, why is this looking like asparagus soup? This is not even tea. What is this? And so I tried again with another tea bag, and it was green tea.
Oh, no milk. Do you put milk in your green tea?
No, I mean, it was an accident. I thought it was brown tea.
Okay.
And I was thinking, why is this brown tea looking like asparagus cup of soup?
Well, you got it sorted, right? You got to have a decent cup of tea for us to sit down and talk.
I'm sorted now. I'm sorted. Yeah.
Very good.
So good.
Well, I as we stall just a minute to let Dave get here, I am glad to have this chance to talk with you two. I've had it in mind to reach out, so I'm glad we've connected.
Ditto, Jay.
I've been doing a kind of, as you know, kind of circle around to find more people who study with Desikachar. And I had the recent conversations with Sri Ram and with Jill Lloyd.
I heard them. I was there. Yeah.
So really I've been wanting to speak with you two about it as well. Now I'm not sure. I don't want to keep going because I want to get Dave here. Where is he? Can you text him? Say, Dave, where are you? Dave? Maybe he's getting his tea sorted out, probably.
I think it'll be a very fine little espresso for him, probably. But
I see. He's more of an espresso guy than a tea guy.
I'm just messaging him now.
Okay.
Yeah, but absolutely. I know of the. I've been really enjoying listening to the show recently, and enjoyed various discussions that you've had with people who have studied with Desikachar and the different takes on the man and the tradition. And I think there's a lot to say. And also, there's quite a lot to say about the whole yoga scene, isn't there, Jay?
There could be, yes. Well, I mean, there's definitely a lot to be said about that, but I'm curious what was in your mind in that moment just now. Like, your mind went somewhere when you said the yoga scene, so I'm not exactly sure what you were referring to.
Well, you've talked. Wait,
here's Dave. Let me get him in.
Is he coming in? Okay.
There he is. Dave, are you there?
I am here.
Hi, Dave. We've been stalling for you. Good to have you here.
Good.
You've just come in on a very profound moment, Dave.
Yes. I was probing him. I mentioned to Ranju that I've been having these conversations with Desikachar students. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to them, Dave, with Jill Lloyd and Sri Ram, and kind of wanting to get into, we'll talk more today about the idea of religiousness, because I've been really interested in that word, religiousness. But first, just now, I kind of caught Ranju in a moment because he made this kind of offhanded comment about the yoga scene.
Okay.
And then I wanted to know what he was thinking, and that's when you just came in. He was about to tell us.
You carry on, Ranju. I'm quite happy to listen.
Well, just as a kickoff, really, it's not just the yoga scene; it's the world scene, isn't it? I mean, I think you've quite often talked, Jay. I've heard you say to various people about how much you felt the yoga scene has changed. I mean, in the States, since you started, and you were saying that your teachers and the people that you originally studied with in the 90s were kind of, I don't know what you call the first generation people coming back from India, and maybe it was a little less mainstream, and then the whole commercialization and as the word that you've used is mainstreaming of yoga, probably through the 2000s. I remember being at a workshop about maybe 10, 12 years ago, and not Donna. What was Donna Farhi? Somebody had said that they had been talking to Donna Farhi, who said, if we're not careful, yoga studios are going to something like yoga studios are going to turn out like Walmart. You're going to have basically Walmart yoga studios, and this kind of supermarket of yoga and a standardization, and we've got to keep things real, got to keep things more traditional. Well, I don't know, whatever that we don't want to go down there. And I think in the last 10 years, not only has the yoga scene, but I suppose I'm just thinking that the world's a pretty crazy place as well. So maybe yoga is just reflecting the craziness of the world. I don't know.
I think it's true. There certainly has been a change in terms of what people think of as yoga, or the presentation of yoga as it became more of an industry. But I think I think you're also right, though, that just yoga seems to be a reflection often of, what did someone recently say on this show, that like formlessness expresses itself through the form of our culture. Okay. So there's sort of like what's happening in the world is happening in yoga kind of thing. And I think you're right to point that out. And that does maybe kind of bring us to sort of some of my initial inspirations of late, or some of my questioning of late, I should say. And it has to do, I said earlier, with this idea of religiousness. And for those of you who don't know, like, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first book, or one of the first books ever published of like Desikachar teachings.
It was the Religiousness in Yoga. Yeah. Religiousness in Yoga was the book, and it was based on some seminars that Desikachar did at Colgate University, I think in 1976.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely. And it was a SUNY Press publication. Mm-hmm. And so, from the States, published in the States, and it was really difficult to get hold of, and it was really expensive at the time. That's what I remember about it.
Yes, it is somewhat obscure. I think most people know of like the Heart of Yoga as like the Desikachar book, but that came later.
Well, the Heart of Yoga was essentially a rewrite of Religiousness in Yoga. It was a rewrite and a simplification.
Yes. See, that's what's interesting to me. It was a simplification, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. Like, there's something very fantastic about that book. I'm grateful for it. I like the Heart of Yoga for many reasons.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me specifically that the first book was called Religiousness in Yoga, because that's kind of what I've been questioning of late.
Absolutely.
And specifically around, even the idea that it's not saying religion, but religiousness. Yes. And I think that, at least for me these days, is referring often to like the notion of God or a higher power. Like, that seems to be where the dividing line is between spirituality and religion or something. And I guess before we get into like maybe some Desikachar teachings or what you learned from Paul on any of this, I'm wondering first to know like where you each are coming from. So did you grow up with religion in your life, in your household? And if so, what was like the beliefs that you were taught around God? Ranju, why don't you go first?
Okay. I was brought up by, my father's Hindu, my mother's white English, and my mother is very strongly atheist. My father is also atheist, I would say, but culturally very Hindu. From a cultural point of view, he's very Hindu. I don't think he's got any particular belief in divinity or anything like that. Although, it's interesting. He's 97 now. He was, I think, at the time when he was growing up, there was a lot of self-deprecation or ambivalence towards their own Hindu culture in India when he was growing up. So, the West is best, and, Western science and progress and all things Western is the way forward, is the future of humanity. And I think a lot of Indians were embarrassed about their own culture and their own beliefs, which I think they might have thought of as a little bit primitive or a little bit. This is what my dad has said to me, so I'm not, but basically, I think he's got a very, very strong connection to a sort of a cultural Hinduism without believing in God. My brother said to me not a couple of weeks ago, he said he remembers asking my mum when we were about 6 or 7, said, what is God? What's God? What's God? And she said something like, well, maybe we were about 8, and she said, well, some people say that Father Christmas exists, and it's a really nice story. Well, some people just still, basically God is like Father Christmas for adults, but some people still believe in it. So okay, so that was how that was.
Wow. So belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus, huh?
Yeah. Whether she would say that now, I don't know. But that's okay. So fair enough. That was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
She may have refined that opinion or changed her opinion. But anyway, so we weren't brought up in a religious way at all. No.
All right. Well, Dave, what about you?
Yeah, I'm the same. I mean, my parents were both, just white British, but we weren't a religious family at all. There was no real connection with the church as such. The only time I ever really went to church was when I was made to go because I wanted to join the Cub Scouts, and you had to go to church for a few times, and also to go to the sort of church youth club because that was quite a good place to hang out at the time. I mean, we got going back a good few years. Yeah. So no, it was not a presence in my life whatsoever, and neither of my parents were particularly, neither of them were interested in religion as far as I'm aware. I think my dad had perhaps more leaning that way. He grew up and was in the choir at a church and things, but it wasn't an active force in our lives. It essentially was something that was basically ignored.
Yeah,
that's what I would say.
I see. And so I guess then, did yoga ever? I don't know. I guess I'm wondering that how that idea of like a higher power, God, has ever been presented to you in the context of yoga, or has the yoga that you were presented always been of a sort of like, not necessarily even atheistic, but a concept in which there doesn't need to be like a supreme being or something?
Well, originally, I think it was presented to a large degree like that it wasn't it wasn't necessarily a big part of, and certainly not a necessary part of one's practice or one's participation in the yoga scene. Obviously, from an early time, we were exposed to this idea of Ishavara Pranidhana as being a possible expression of practice, that actually there was something to be important about that kind of practice. But it was almost, as I remember, Ranju, and you correct me if it's wrong, that it was almost as if this was adopting such an attitude was kind of skillful means. It was like helpful in your development, but it wasn't. Yeah. It didn't necessarily have to be framed within any particular religious belief or belief.
It was kind of from a psychological perspective, wasn't it, Dave?
It was more like that. That was certainly the way I think that initially, at least, it was presented by Paul. I think the story changed over the years.
How so?
Well, I think certainly within Desikachar's teaching, and certainly this became reflected, I think, in Paul's attitude, it became a more important feature. And we, for the last 20 years, we weren't really involved so strongly with Desikachar directly. But I can remember even back in the late 90s, Desikachar saying, words to the effect that he said something like, if you practice sincerely, I feel bhakti is inevitable.
Mm.
Which is quite a strong thing to say, I think.
Yes, it is. And it's a very interesting way to frame it, because bhakti is this kind of devotional feeling, right? This kind of, and that is an entry into Ishavara Pranidhana in a way.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my question to both of you is, how was it defined to you, Ishavara Pranidhana? Because I think that is a key thing when you say it's presented as kind of like an intellectual or like a psychological concept. Well, what was that psychological concept that was presented?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was intellectual. I think it was more about, particularly within the context of the way Patanjali presents Kriya Yoga, or the way we were taught Kriya Yoga, is you have this idea that tapas, you've got to do something challenging to yourself, which is purifying, and it involves some going against your own habits and commitment to something or other, tapas.
And there's a friction to it, that's right, that creates the heat, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Then swadhyaya, which is the way we were taught originally, was, this idea of somehow reflecting on how you're doing, checking in with your compass, and to see, am I going in a good direction? How am I developing? So it's a kind of a self-reflection. And then the outcome of those two was Ishavara Pranidhana, which I think in Desikachar's translation, he talked about it as acknowledging that we're not the master, we're not, that there's a higher force. Well, how does he put it? Something like that there's a higher force, or that in the end we're not the masters of our own destiny, or something like that. So there's something like it's quite a vague notion. It's not a very specific notion, and I think it's one that pretty much everybody can get behind, can't they? I mean, we are not the masters of our own destiny. Whatever you do, and however sincere you are in doing it, things may turn out different to how you wish them to turn out. And that's and kind of an acceptance of that is Ishavara Pranidhana. That seems to me to be a kind of a very basic level, entry level Ishavara Pranidhana, which doesn't really require the belief in a divine being. It just requires an acceptance of the fact that things might be different to how we would like them to be. And, that's it.
I remember there was one retreat that Desikachar did, I remember, and he was somewhat sort of jokingly, but he kept on saying, it's all about who's the boss, he said repeatedly, and I think that the reflection on that kind of question, where ultimately is the controller or the force in this universe that causes things to happen. I think that's essentially the question that was being invited, really.
Well, I think that is right to the point I was hoping to get to, this idea of who is the boss. And the issue, not an issue, but the question is that if Ishavara Pranidhana is presented as just like another skillful means, like you were saying before, then there is this kind of implication that you are the complete driver, that there isn't necessary, that you're the boss in some way. And you can say, all right, well, I don't have control over what's going to happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something or someone else does, I guess.
Yeah, I think in what you're saying, Jay, I think it's important to appreciate, I think the environment in which this was presented to us, both by Paul and by Desikachar, really changed over the years. It wasn't, it wasn't a uniform message by any means. The importance of Ishavara Pranidhana, of Bhakti, it seemed to gradually become more and more prominent in the teachings. And I personally, I think that reflected probably Desikachar's movement from being somebody who was very scientifically influenced, was influenced by Krishnamurti, was very experimental in his youth. And as he got older, he appeared to kind of move towards his the sort of religious tradition in which his father grew up. So I think we do have to appreciate this question in that sense, in that it wasn't a uniform teaching. It seems to me it kind of, the emphasis very much changed over the years.
I think that's right. I think in the early days, the influence of Krishnamurti and was much stronger. Well, it seemed to be much stronger, and the whole aspect of bhakti, and also perhaps the kind of religious tradition of, specifically a Vaishnavite an Indian tradition became more manifest. I don't know whether Sri Ram or people would agree with that, but that's how it seemed from the outside. And the other thing I was just going to say about Ishavara Pranidhana, the way it was presented, and I quite like this idea, is that it's presented at three places in the Yoga Sutra. It's presented at the beginning of chapter 2 in the Kriya Yoga. It's presented sort of midway through chapter 2 as part of the Niyama. And then it's presented in chapter 1. And the way we were taught it as well, and this makes sense, is that there's a kind of a vinyasa of emphasis in the two words. So in tapas, in Kriya Yoga at the beginning of chapter 2, Ishvara Pranidhana, 2 words. Ishvara, the highest, Lord or whatever. Pranidhana, bowing down to, or surrendering to, or it's to do with an attitude towards the highest force. In Kriya Yoga, the emphasis is on the attitude. In the Niyama section in the middle of chapter 2, the emphasis is kind of shifting. And then in chapter 1, where there are 7 or 8 sutras on Ishvara, it's all about Ishvara. So it goes from your attitude to all about what you're focusing on. And I think that's quite an interesting idea, that, those 2 words, where is your emphasis? Is it more on the attitude, the pranidhana, or is it more on the actual object of your focus? I don't know if that makes sense.
I know it makes perfect sense. I mean, that's been my own personal experience, and what's kind of motivated these conversations is doing my tapas and svadhyaya has led me to try to understand Ishvara Pranidhana in new ways.
Perhaps that's exactly what Dave was saying about all roads lead to bhakti. Maybe that's where it's been going for you.
Maybe. And I think what you just said about the idea of it being kind of an attitude, I think that's right. For a long time, I've had a very devotional attitude in practice, and I've held on to chanting despite the kind of market forces that told me that I should let go of it to be more, to be a more, to cast a wider net, so to speak. From a marketing standpoint, but I've always held on to the chanting because of this certain attitude that the chanting seems to bring out very naturally. And I guess what you just said about, okay, so there's an attitude, but then it's an attitude towards Ishvara, right? And then what is that? And I guess that's what my question's been of late, is that if Ishvara is just like an impersonal force, it leads one to have certain feelings about themselves in relationship to the rest of the universe. That's different than if Ishvara is actually like a supreme being. And it is personalized in a sense that I don't know, I guess it ultimately comes down to what Desikachar was saying, that are you like God? Are you equal to God? Or is there something above you? Right?
Yep.
And I guess
what Jay, can I ask you a question?
Please do.
What difference in your life does it make? I mean, you have a choice to believe or not to believe in God. It's so difficult to say it in language.
I know. Believe me, I know.
How does it change the way we live?
I love that question. It's the right question to ask. And I'm still kind of trying to understand it, but I would say it does make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I would also add that I've come to this very reluctantly. Like, it's almost like I wanna stay with where I've always been in my adult life, which was based on this very yogic idea that there's some universal space of consciousness where all opposites become one, right?
Okay.
So the idea that there's this unity place, this union in yoga where all opposites become one has always been of great comfort to me. It alleviated me the feeling that I needed to rely upon an external authority that I could come from within myself. And it's very empowering in many ways. The idea that you can develop skillful means to have your methodless method, as Krishnamurti would say, ultimately being able to kind of like be more of the boss, in your life. And I think there's something very positive about that, and why so many people have benefited and feel passionate about yoga is it does offer us vehicle for that kind of facility of awareness and ultimately discernment, maybe. But I would say that as I've come into my latter years, I turned 51 recently, I think that it starts to feel like it's all on my shoulders in a way, like that there's certain times that I was presented of late challenges in my life, and people who listen to the show know with my daughter and with the pandemic, and a lot of people I think experience this. It goes to what Ranju said at the beginning about the changing world that we're living in, that there is a certain support and feeling of strength and being held by life in a certain way that's different when you relate to this mystery or this something higher as like a creator.
Yeah.
As opposed to just some kind of abstract notion about non-duality. Because an abstract notion about non-duality is very interesting and satisfies me intellectually, but like on some kind of core emotional somatic level, when I'm on my knees at the feet of the Lord because life put me there, it changes it. And I think there's a benefit. There's a benefit that you get from having a relationship to a creator that you don't have if it's just this abstract idea.
And I think that's been there in India, hasn't it, for millennia? I mean, I think if you look at some of the debates, for example, between the different schools of Vedanta, I think this is a very important theme, really. You've got Shankara's Vedanta, which is much more, you could say, pure in the sense it doesn't have the such importance laid on devotion, and then you've got Ramanuja's Vedanta, which is quite the opposite. Mm-hmm. And so I think this has been an enduring debate, even within India.
I guess the other question I have around it is the idea that if you're like of the first, like the Shankaracharya view, it kind of is this place of like, there's no right or wrong necessarily. And I think that that's really where like some things happen. I've had these conversations about evil. First I was like, is there such thing as evil in the world? Because I felt like there actually is right or wrong.
Yeah. I like Eckhart Tolle. I think he talked about the word sin as meaning missing the mark. Just missing the mark if you're trying to aim for something. And I thought that was a good way of thinking about evil. You're just missing the mark. You're not acting with the Dharma, with the Tao, whatever it is. You're going against that and creating some kind of chaos. So that was be a thought about evil. I mean, I'm a little reluctant to straight up say that evil. Well, I don't know.
That's the question. That is the question.
I know.
Does evil exist? Is there such thing as like malevolent forces or entities even? And I guess that's a question I would have that we can get into some sutra stuff, because I know that's a focus for you too a lot is, like 3rd chapter, 4th chapter sutras is where they talk about cities and powers. And I don't know if you guys heard my talk with Josh Schrei about animistic cultures that yoga comes out of, where there was already baked in certain beliefs that there are entities and malevolent forces that you have to ward off or whatnot. So I guess I'm just curious about that in terms of, we rarely hear about 3rd or 4th chapters. Do you think that sutras does it teach anything about these kinds of things?
I think the reason why we more rarely hear about chapters 3 and 4 is that chapters 1 and 2 are far more accessible to a psychological framework, to a kind of they're more accessible to a culture which sees things through a psychological lens. You can look at chapters 1 and 2 from a very therapeutic, from a I'm going to say from a kind of a Western modern viewpoint. You can see these things. There are a few strange sutras even in chapter 1 and chapter 2. I'm thinking of the these disembodied characters. What's that sutra? Is it 19?
And
has these disembodied yogis who are kind of trapped in Mula Prakriti or something. But on the whole, you can do quite a good psychological job on chapter 1, chapter 2. But the fact of the matter is, let us not deny, chapter 3 is as big a chapter as chapter 1 or chapter 2. It's a huge part. Chapter 4 is slightly shorter, but these are big parts of the sutra. And there are lots of sutras in chapter 3 which are... There's lots of stuff which you can say in chapter 3, I think, which is understandable from a psychological point of view, particularly around the early parts. There are some very interesting parts about how change happens, and some ideas around therapy, Vyutana Nirodha 3.9. But there's a huge chunk of it which is quite mysterious and perhaps animistic, and perhaps challenges our modern day notions.
Yeah. And what I take from that, rather than actually thinking about the individual cities themselves, I think there are two or three kind of key things that are significant for me in this. First one is that I feel yoga is essentially a mystic path. It's a path of mysticism and mystic experience. And I think sometimes that's got a bit lost in, its Western presentation. It's suggesting possibilities of going beyond our normal range of experience, and increasingly, I think that's an important aspect to yoga. I think the other thing for me is the notion that's implied is that actually what limits our experience is essentially the functioning of our conventional mind and our reliance on our conventional senses, and that actually the path of mysticism in yoga is somehow letting go of some of that stuff. Not to say it's not useful in a conventional context, but actually to let go of some of that stuff. And then the implication is that the horizon of our perception and what becomes possible begins to open up. So I think there's an important paradigm embedded in there, and it's about somehow letting go of our normal intellectual and thought processes and the limitations that the conventional mind imposes. I don't know whether that makes any sense or not.
It makes perfect sense, both of you. I think you're right. I think I came to yoga because of its mystical roots, and I wanted to challenge conventional perceptions. That was what yoga was presented to me as originally, but as we discussed earlier, like as time went on, it was much less and less about that. and more about fitness, I guess you would say. But I guess what I find interesting is that this idea that it's mystical, a mystical tradition, and that it's opening up the realm of possibility is also where this question comes in about, are you God? Because that's the pitfall that I think I fell into some. That there's a certain tendency in yoga for it to make it seem like you have the power of the creator, but
I think this emphasis, on self-empowerment, which you've kind of suggested, and which certainly I've definitely come across in our encounter with yoga, not from Desikachar actually, but more through sort of Western students. I think that is a particularly Western notion, and I don't know for sure, Ranju, you might have something more to say about that, but I don't think that's a current that is present very strongly in India in relation to yoga practice. Do you?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, looking back on my own reasons for coming into yoga, I mean, there are many reasons. I mean, I was interested in all sorts, but there was something about, and I'm sure it is for most of us, is that there is something about empowering oneself, getting stronger in your body, being able to do these, crazy postures, being able to breathe more, being healthier. These are kind of like, okay, bottom line, these are the beginnings of putting on an armor to face the inevitable consequences of living, which is dealing with death, illness, and collapse. That's where that's ultimately what we have to deal with at some point. And yoga seemed to me a good way of starting out to protect oneself from that. And I think some people get stuck in self-improvement and self-empowerment, and actually the journey is to go from self-improvement or self-empowerment to surrender. I think you have to.
No, I completely agree. And actually, I started yoga for that. I think, unconsciously, I think I started yoga as an anesthetic against the pain of life and the inevitability of, I thought it would make me, immortal's the wrong word.
It would reverse the aging process. That's what they told me.
Yeah,
and you could become enlightened, and then you would be in samadhi, and you'd be beyond time and space.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I now realise that's not going to happen.
You're still here, though, Dave. You're still here. Doing yoga.
Hanging on.
Well, I think that's right. I think that is, in our 20s, Dave and I we met when we were in our 20s, and, rather unusually, that's what we were both doing. We both met on the same Desikachar inspired retreat in 1987 or whatever it was. And we were both in our, early to mid 20s. And it's interesting that we were doing that, and kind of lurking probably at the back of both of our minds was some anxiety about what the future holds, and that doesn't get any easier as you get older. But maybe
Ranju, I absolutely, definitely. I mean, my father struggled with anxiety, depression, all his life. And I kind of saw him really, in some sense, destroyed by the company system at the time and medical system at the time. And I thought, this isn't going to happen to me. So yoga seemed like the way out. I mean, I look back on it now and I think, well, perhaps that was a little naive. Well, it was very naive, but I think that was a very, very strong driver for me. Yoga was going to stop that happening to me.
And when you get magazines like Yoga Journal, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and you get these images of godlike, I mean, let's call them asana gods, the people who just look, oh my God,
they certainly did. It's like, if you could do that, then blank, whatever.
But the fact that we've come to realize is even if you can do that, you still might feel shit inside.
Mm-hmm. No, you can totally make that picture happen and still be a wreck. Absolutely.
Who cares? I mean, who cares?
Yeah.
So I think there's a shift in the maturation of one's relationship with yoga, or maturation of my relationship with yoga, from thinking I am going to build some kind of, well, if not invincible, but certainly less vulnerable person who's able to transcend the normal sufferings of life, to somehow thinking, okay, this is my tool for dealing with the inevitable sufferings of life, because we're not going to get away from those sufferings.
No.
I think that's so right. And it is sort of the maturation process that I think a lot of people have gone through, where there's this like asana focus and this idea about what might be accomplished through asana practice. And at some point realizing it wasn't what you thought it was. And if it then stops becoming about being able to do poses or how intricately you can do them, practice takes on like a different role or a different function in your life. And I guess that's where, for me, it also started to feel like a lot more like it wanted to be like a prayer kind of feeling around it.
I really like that.
Because and then I'll just point out that, there's all kinds of interesting studies. I had someone on to discuss about how like people who pray and have a certain kind of spiritual core have like thicker cortical walls and less anxiety and depression because of that. So I do think that there is a very practical benefit to having like prayer be an activity in someone's life. I guess I'm curious, do you have prayer in your life, or does your practice serve as a form of prayer, or is prayer even a word that you ever use?
Well, I think that I've really liked, and I have used in my classes. I think that you were talking, maybe it came from you.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.